So this is a really interesting point, and I admire your consistency about the mating bond versus the ship war a lot. But this absolutely highlights my problem with A Court of Mist and Fury. So I've mentioned this before in very, very early videos when I started making stuff for TikTok. My issue with Tamlin very early on is that the love story was orchestrated because he needed to save his court because they had the masks on them and Amarantha had cursed them and all this sort of stuff. So Feyre really could have been any human female that hated fairies a bunch. But Tamlin falls in love with Feyre because Feyre is the one who stumbles into his story. And while I get that that is the nature of the beast and the nature of this particular plot, I remember being like, it doesn't feel like he fell in love with Feyre for Feyre. It felt like he fell in love with Feyre out of circumstance. And then we get Rhysand, who in ACOTAR 1, I actually don't have a problem with. I know a lot of people who are on the anti-Rhysand side of things who don't like the way he acted in ACOTAR 1. And while I don't like his actions in a vacuum either, I do think that the Amarantha situation was just so fucking horrible that there was no way to get through that morally unscathed. So he did what he had to do. But during the Amarantha situation, he is definitely mistreating Feyre as part of his role and the stuff that he has to do in order to protect everybody under the mountain. On some level, though, it seems like he's vibing with Feyre for Feyre. It's not romantic at this point, but he is allying with Feyre. He is trusting in Feyre for Feyre and the things that only Feyre can bring to the table. And then ACOMAF rolls around and Feyre doesn't want to marry Tamlin, and Rhysand feels her through the bond or through their mind reading connection or whatever, and he takes her and then they don't get married. And as ACOMAF continues, I'm not a fan of Rhysand, like as a romantic love interest, just because of all the stuff that happened in ACOTAR 1. Just because I could justify it during ACOTAR 1 doesn't mean that I wasn't counting all of those things against him as a love interest in ACOMAF. But again, I felt like I could vibe the first time I read A Court of Mist and Fury, specifically because it felt like it wasn't about, Feyre wasn't filling a position. Feyre was Feyre. This is, in simplest terms, why I'm more of an Elriel girly than an Lucian girly. Whenever Lucian speaks about Elain, it's always Elain as his mate. It sort of seems like Elain is just Lucian's mate. Like, it's not like Lucian cares about Elain for Elain. It's just Elain is his mate, therefore he is biologically compelled to want her in a way that Azriel isn't, not being Elain's mate because Azriel is into Elain because Elain is Elain. But back to Rhysand. A Court of Mist and Fury continues, and then Feyre catches the Suriel, and oh, oopsie, it turns out that they are mated after all. And I remember being like, all right then. On the first read through of ACOMAF, I was like, all right, whatever. Like, I guess this makes sense. They were talking about the mate thing. This was foreshadowed. I guess I could vibe with this. And in chapter 54, when Rhysand explains himself in the "This is why I'm not a douchebag" speech, he mentions that he had always known on some level that Feyre was his mate. And the first time I was like, ugh, that's a little cheesy, but like, whatever. But then I read it a second time when my friend in my book club, in my real life book club, started reading ACOTAR. And when I read chapter 54, "This is why I'm not a douchebag" speech, ACOMAF felt hollow at that point. And then ACOMAF just started sucking, and it's one of my least favorites of the entire SJM universe now. And the reason why is that during the Rhysand love story, it's different with Rhysand versus Tamlin, because Tamlin romanced Feyre because he had to. And it felt like Rhysand was romancing Feyre because he wanted to. But then when you add in the context of Feyre being Rhysand's mate, Rhysand knowing long before that Feyre was his mate, and bringing in that whole thing where the males are more driven by the bond than the females are, and then the males are driven to madness when it's not fulfilled, ACOMAF just felt really hollow and kind of icky. I was even a little less enthused when Nesta and Cassian turned out to be mates as well, because ACOMAF was going super well, and it felt like Cassian was into Nesta for Nesta, and everything was cool, and I was super into it on the first read through, because I had missed that whole Cassian being in love with Morrigan until my second read through. So when the mating bond popped for them, I was like, ugh, icky, but fine, I can deal. Until Cassian says, oh, I kind of picked up on it when you were human. And at that point, I'm like, because at that point, Cassian didn't romance Nesta for Nesta. He romanced Nesta because he felt the animal urge to, thanks to the mating bond. And it's icky. That's icky. Which is why I say again, we could have a full choice here. We could have Elain actively choosing a mate versus not a mate, and then we could have the men react to that choice and make choices that they can rise above the animal urge to go mad upon not being chosen, which I still think that's an icky thing if that cannot be a defiable thing for them. That being said, though, I know we disagree about Elriel. I think because I'm hoping for Lucian and or Azriel to be able to rise above that penchant for madness that rejected males have. And I think you might be on the more cynic side of things here. But either way, I really admire your consistency, and you are based as fuck. Can we be friends?